13 die as hurricane-force winds sweep southern Britain. Railways and roads are blocked, hundreds of thousands stay off work. The trail of havoc from coast to coast.
Every year, 100 or so low-pressure systems pass over Britain, bringing wet and cloudy and windy weather. Most of the time, you don't notice us. I mean, what's so unusual about a bit of wind and rain in the UK? But I was different. I wanted to be remembered. This is my story. I was born somewhere over the North Atlantic, the product of two air masses coming together. It was all very romantic.
A depression forms by having cold air coming down from the north and the warm air pushing up from the south. As those two meet, the cold air tries to push in behind and the warm air tries to push forward in the front. And the whole of the system moves anti-clockwise around the low pressure.
I spin across the ocean towards land, picking up energy and momentum as I go. At this distance, I don't look like anything special. But as I grow and mature, my centre of pressure deepens, and the temperature difference between my areas of warm and cold air increases. I'm getting stronger and faster and closer.
The day before the storm, from what I can remember, was just an absolutely normal day. I believe it was a sunny day as well.
Typically, ahead of a depression, it can be quite calm and mild, and then you begin to see the cloud form as the warm front approaches.
The weathermen were a little worried because someone had reported that they'd seen some data that said there was a storm coming. The channel I happened to be watching, the weather forecaster on there said, no, nothing to worry about. There's, you know, a bit of wind, but not anything exceptional.
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that, actually, the weather will become very windy, but most of the strong winds, incidentally, will be down over Spain and across into France.
But then later on that evening, there was the report of, you know, a fair breeze coming. Still, nobody knew exactly how it was going to be and what was actually going to happen.
My warm front moves slowly and steadily over the country, bringing light winds and rain. So far, my behaviour is just as you'd expect from a weather depression. But this is when it starts to get interesting.
Behind the warm front, you get into what we call the warm sector. And there again, the air can be calmer, but a lot warmer than previously. But it is really the calm before the storm.
Not a cold night by any means. In fact, down here in the south, it's very mild at the moment with these quite strong southwesterly winds. But these northwesterlies already into the West Country, they'll be pushing their way across, bringing clearer weather and colder weather too.
Night falls, and I throw caution to the wind. My cold front generates gales that blow across the length of southern England. In no time at all, I'm gusting at 50, 60, 70 knots and rising.
At 8 o'clock, we had a call from next door just to say that the scaffolding over the front of their building had dislodged itself from the building, was flapping around and obviously causing a hazard to people walking down the road. We went from that call next door and our bells were then ringing, and that was the start, and we never came back to the fire station all evening after that.
The cold front is the really active bit of the depression. That's where we get most of the significant weather. And there you'd expect to see a much more thickening of the clouds, strong rainfall, sometimes even some thunder and lightning, and of course the winds begin to pick up quite significantly.
and everything was taking off. So as we were driving, any rubbish bins, boxes, anybody who's put their bags out were flying down the road. And you could see people struggling actually to walk.
Well, as the cold front passes over, you'd expect it to get very windy, a lot of rain, sometimes quite heavy rain, and of course the temperatures will turn much colder. There's a strong temperature and pressure gradient between the warm air in front of the cold front and the cold air behind it. And of course the winds are trying to move to equalise that pressure out, which is why we get very strong wind flow across the cold front.
I remember waking up in the middle of the night and the trees against the windows were rattling on the window panes, and you could feel the house being buffeted. So it was clear that we were getting some very strong winds.
And we were driving along through Clerkenwell and all the power for London shut off, so everything was black. There was no lights or anything.
My spiralling dance across England is almost over. I'm feeling tired and drained. It's been an eventful night.
And then it started to sort of slow down. It was still really strong winds, but the sort of where you couldn't walk, where you were being pushed while you were walking along, had stopped. It was just very, very windy.
Behind the cold front, the winds will begin to ease down, the rain will stop or slow, and the cloud will begin to break, so you'll return back to calmer conditions.
The debris wasn't actually taking off and sort of in motion down the road, but everything was in the wrong place.
Eventually, as the cold front catches up with the warm front and the occlusion forms, then we begin to lose a lot of the energy from the depression systems. Pressure and temperature are beginning to equalise, and the whole system begins to decay.
At daybreak, I exit the UK via the northeast coast, a shadow of my former self. But I've left a strong impression.
And from the newsroom, the latest on the violent storms which have ravaged the whole of southern England. During the night, hurricane-force winds have blown down power lines and trees, blocking many roads and railway lines.
Waking up to this all over the south, I remember walking outside of my front door and just seeing absolute devastation. There was bits of fences, roof tiles, trees, everywhere, across the roads, across the pavements, and it was absolutely astonishing to see it.
The hurricane-force winds which lashed the capital in the early hours of the morning were the worst ever recorded, up to 107 miles an hour. The West End took a battering. Some department stores had their shop fronts blown out.
You looked at the devastation thinking it doesn't match the day. You know, it's now light, it's daylight. And actually having a really good look around at places that you drive past or walk past every day, looking completely different.
The London Fire Brigade was inundated with a record number of emergency calls.
Just debris everywhere, like a sort of bomb had gone off.
Troops were called in to help clear up at a devastated caravan site on the south coast.
We used to spend our time holidaying down in Essex, where we had a caravan right on the coast, and we got a phone call from someone that worked on the caravan site to say that our caravan, along with many hundreds of others, was had been damaged, basically, in fact completely written off.
By dawn the winds had died down, but the damage remained. Many roads were blocked by fallen trees.
Already insurance companies are being contacted by thousands of people wanting to make claims.
We had two 60-foot grain silos, one of which was full of grain, and that wasn't affected, but the empty one, that silo had stood for 50 years, but that night it was squeezed out of all recognition, like it was a fairy liquid bottle. Someone with a giant thumb had pushed it in.
And further along the south coast, a graphic example of the power of the storm. A Sussex woodland, flattened by the wind.
The last crop to harvest that year was a crop of maize, which the day before had been a verdant green, and that wind through the night had desiccated it white, transformed it completely.
If the high winds blew down a tree or a fence in your garden, spare a thought for the curators of the National Botanic Gardens at Kew. Hundreds of rare trees and plants were uprooted or damaged last night.
There are 14,000 trees in the Arboretum at Kew, and as a result of the storm, we actually had about 1,000 trees damaged. And there were trees actually leaning on each other. It was like dominoes had gone over, and there were whole woodlands that were just completely devastated. It wasn't just the sheer force of the wind. It actually got some of the trees and almost corkscrewed them. And some of them had been blown over completely, others hadn't. They'd actually been snapped halfway up the trunk, which was really, really strange, having literally a tree cut in half.
Recent heavy rain contributed to the disaster by saturating the ground and loosening the grip of the roots.
500 trees were either blown over or so badly damaged that we just couldn't do anything with them other than remove them. And the other remaining 500 we managed to work on and to get them safe again, and most of them are still standing today.
Well, here now, returning to the subject of the weather here at home, which has devastated parts of southern and central England, is the duty weatherman this morning, John Ketley. John, why didn't you predict this?
The thing that caught us out in terms of forecasting the storm was it developed much more rapidly than we'd expected. So when it started in the Atlantic, it looked like just a normal depression, and pressure levels were fairly similar to what we would expect from an Atlantic depression. But of course, because the sea surface temperatures were much, much warmer than usual at that time of year, that gave it enough energy to grow and develop much more quickly than we expected. And with the jet stream pushing it, it moved towards the UK much quicker than we expected as well.
I was the biggest storm to hit the UK for over 200 years. Although I caused a lot of damage and devastation, it could have been a lot worse. Imagine if I'd taken a different path across the country, or visited during the daytime. With the changing climate, who knows how soon we'll meet again. What's certain is that I've left an indelible mark on the people and the places that I passed on my journey, and I won't be forgotten in a hurry.
I'll always remember October 1987, that night. I'll never forget it. I experienced more violent weather than I'd ever known before, and I hope I'll never see it again.
But there are certain days in your career that you will remember, certain people in your career that you will remember, but that night was especially because it's 22 years later, and I can remember parts of it as if it was yesterday.
I mean, in terms of a one-off night that I'm going to remember till the day I die, that storm of that year in 1987 was certainly a night to remember.